Yeah, it's a real honour to be asked to give this talk to you and for the Royal Institution. It's a surprise in many ways. We'll get on to why, but it's a real honour. And as Hassan said, it's based on the findings from my book, The Last Drop: Solving the World's Water Crisis. That's a big subject, and there's a lot to fit in, so I will crack on. So, what we'll cover today, starting with where our water comes from, which sounds self explanatory, but is actually a little more complex than you might think. Then, how the water cycle is changing, in particular, the impact of climate change in regard to flooding and drought. Human mismanagement, because it turns out that we didn't need climate change to cause all of our problems, we were causing a lot of them for ourselves. Tech solutions, so can we just desalinate our way out of this? Spoiler, the answer is no, but there are other tech options. And nature-based solutions and what we can do. The good news is there's a lot we can do, and a lot of it results in a greener, more pleasant world. So if you get depressed in the first half of the talk, hang on in there. There's good news coming around the corner. And first, a little bit about me and why I wrote this book. And the slide, this is me on the travels for the book, looking increasingly concerned and disheveled as time went by. I'm not a scientist or an engineer or a geographer. I'm a journalist with an arts background. My skill and expertise, such as they are being able to put the pieces of the jigsaw together to tell a story. I interviewed hundreds of experts and scientists from many different disciplines, and I not only tell their story, something that some academics and professionals understandably aren't always good at doing, but I then fit their jigsaw piece in place and continue building the puzzle. And that process essentially explains the past 3 years or so of my life, tracking down experts, learning from them, slotting their puzzle piece in place, and moving on until I felt I had the full picture. And that became my book, The Last Drop. And so far, the reception has been very good. So I humbly recommend you get a copy. But anyway, enough of that. Onto the talk. Where water comes from. So given that 70% of our blue planet's surface is water, a water crisis seems impossible. However, 97% of that is sea or salt water. We can't drink it. So just that little sliver at the top, 2.5%, is fresh water. Of that 2.5%, only almost 2/3 of that are trapped in ice caps and glaciers. So we can't access it. The other third is groundwater, and then only a tiny sliver at the top is 1.2% of the 2.5% is surface water. And of the surface water, of the tiny 1.2%, most of that is trapped in ground ice and permafrost. Less than a quarter is in lakes, rivers, and wetlands, what we think of as surface water. As the charity WaterAid puts it, if a bucket contained all the world's water, 1 teacup of that would be fresh water, and just 1 teaspoon of that would be available for us to use. And to blow your minds even further, 20% of all the lake water is held in one lake alone, Lake Baikal in Siberia, Russia, which, as you can see, is terrifyingly deep. And by the way, I like this little stat at the top too. 0.26% of all fresh water is held in living things, including us, which is a nice reminder that we are all made of water and as much a part of the water cycle as any tree or lake. Although if we extracted all the water from all the humans, it still wouldn't be enough to fill Lake Baikal. Where our drinking water comes from is from places like this. This is my local reservoir, Farmore, near Oxford. And these chaps are Will and Duncan from Thames Water, who run it and showed me around. Farmore is one of Thames Water's largest, 8 kilometres in circumference, holding some 14,000 million litres of water. That's 14 million cubic metres. This is where the tap water in my house, 42 kilometers away, comes from. So the water travels quite a distance. And believe it or not, built in 1976, Farmore is actually one of Thames Water's and England's newer reservoirs. We haven't had a major reservoir built since 1991. The water that fills up such reservoirs starts in local tributary rivers like this. This is the River Cherwell in the town where I live. Believe it or not, that's it on a good day. Normally there's a shopping trolley or two sticking out. The flow of the river is a mix of rainwater, groundwater, but also agricultural runoff, effluent from the local sewage works, and runoff from the roadside drains. This then flows into the Thames, which is itself a mixture of all those things, and is then captured in reservoirs downstream like Farmore. This is the intake tower at Farmore, where the water is taken into the adjacent water treatment works. This is inside the water treatment works. This is one of the stages called flocculation, where air bubbles are blasted through the water, forcing impurities up to the top, forming that kind of Halloween-esque green scum that you can see. And this is just a picture of the signage I took as I walked around. As you can see, everything is still very Windows 98. Now, we are therefore very reliant on rainfall, forming our rivers and groundwater and filling our reservoirs. And it rains a lot in England, according to common conception. Actually, it's not so true. As we can see in this 3D representation of rainfall in Great Britain, essentially the majority of our weather systems come across the Atlantic, dump on the first landmass they meet, which is Ireland, missing from the picture, and then Western Great Britain, and then run out of steam as they move central and eastern. The centre and east of England is actually very dry. How dry? In southeast England, the annual average rainfall figures linger around 500 to 600 millimetres a year. Internationally, that's dry. It's comparable to Kenya, to Lebanon, and drier than most Australian state capital cities. Not quite believing those figures myself, when I started this book, I set up my own back garden weather station at my home in Oxfordshire, which is not even that far south or particularly east, by the way, just on the cusp of both. I've been doing this for 3 years now, recording weekly rainfall in Excel. And lo and behold, each year has ended around the 600 millimetre mark. And also what I've learned from doing this is that, yes, we have a lot of grey and drizzly days compared to our continental European neighbours, but grey and drizzle don't actually add up to that much in the rain gauge. We also have a rainy season. We are very heavily reliant on winter rainfall to top up our reservoirs and groundwater supplies. A drier winter is disastrous for water companies. And talking of disastrous, our planetary water cycle, on which we are all reliant, is changing due to climate change. And that is changing rainfall patterns in every country, causing huge headaches for water companies. Why is it changing? Well, it's actually for a remarkably simple reason. And I rather like this illustration of it from the Climate Council Australia, showing why. A warmer climate creates more evaporation, holds more water vapor in the atmosphere, and causes more intense rainfall. It's the water cycle but speeded up, or someone's hit the turbo button. We actually have figures on this. Approximately 7% more moisture is added into the atmosphere for each 1 degree centigrade rise in global mean temperature. Now, one thing the now section actually gets wrong here is saying more rainfall. In fact, there's little evidence yet for more overall rainfall globally, but when the rain falls, it's heavier, more intense, followed by longer periods of drought. So more intense rainfall. According to UN Water, the number and duration of droughts has increased by 29% since the year 2000, while flood-related disasters have increased by 134%. So we're now in a stage of yo-yoing between flood and drought. What does this look like? Well, it looks like spectacular rain events like this. This was Hong Kong only last month. Now that was Hong Kong being hit by 150 millimeters of rainfall in 1 hour. Now, 150 millimeters would be heavy rainfall, would be a heavy rainfall month in England. That's all falling in just 1 hour. So think of the last very rainy month you can think of, then condense that all into 1 hour. That's what fell in Hong Kong. When it rains in Hong Kong, it rains hard. Everyone knows that, but never as hard as this. Nowhere is quite prepared for these events. These are known as atmospheric rivers or weather bombs. Extreme rainfall events caused by the changing moisture percentages in the air. Again, in September, this was Greece, a completely different weather system, different part of the world to Hong Kong, obviously. Now, this rainfall figure is one of the most extreme I've seen, actually. Parts of Greece were hit by 400 millimeters of rain in 24 hours. But one weather station in Zagora saw 754 millimeters. That's 30 inches in old money in one day. Now, the more typical annual rainfall is 400 millimeters. So imagine 2 years worth of rain falling in one day. The country was totally unprepared for it, but I must stress how hard it is to prepare for this. And we were likely starting to see some of the most intense rainfall events in human history. Now, some of that's an educated guess, obviously, but I refer back to the 7% increase in atmospheric moisture for 1 degree of temperature rise. And in the last decade alone, the world has warmed by 0.25 degrees Celsius because of man-made climate change. The most catastrophic of all this summer was Libya. This was Storm Daniel, the same storm that hit Greece, passing down over the Mediterranean to Libya, losing little of its strength and killing thousands of people in Libya. But again, the rainfall figures are extraordinary. Close to 414 millimeters in one day. I've seen one estimate put it at 1,000 millimeters across the 3 days of the storm. So much more than the annual average rainfall in Libya, much more than the annual average rainfall in southern England in 3 days. So most dams would struggle to deal with that. Indeed, a recent UN report found that the majority of the world's large dams have surpassed their intended lifespan. In the US alone, over 85% have passed their intended engineered lifespan. Now, atmospheric rivers, weather bomb events in the past couple of years alone have hit Australia, Brazil, China, Spain, Pakistan, to name just a few, New York and Brooklyn this week. A warmer climate means the frequency of such atmospheric river events increases because they're carrying more fuel essentially from a wetter atmosphere. Here's a graph showing much the same from a UK perspective. So at the bottom here on the x-axis, starting from 1890 going up to 2020. So we've got UK rainfall intensity trending upwards over those decades, correlating with UK temperature trending upwards over those decades, correlating with global temperature going upwards, and also correlating with carbon dioxide levels going upwards. So more intense rainfall, but also longer periods of drought. I visited Ghana, where people are already seeing the impact of this changing water cycle. The country used to have 2 reliable rainy seasons a year, one in May and one in September, but now the rains don't arrive when expected. This is a rural reservoir that I visited in rainy season in September. This should have been full to bursting. The water level really should be up around that tree line, but it was almost running dry, and the villagers were genuinely scared about where they were going to get their water from. They were looking into getting a municipal tap supply. Ghana actually has plentiful water and plentiful mainline water systems, but to connect them to a rural area, they were looking at bills just completely unaffordable. I met people spending half their earnings on clean water. So climate change is making our water problems harder to deal with and more acute. But much of the problem is entirely man-made, a legacy of the choices made in the 20th century. This is a picture I took of the Karameh Dam in Jordan. I tell this story in the opening pages of my book because it's a suitable parable of modern water mismanagement. Jordan is one of the most water-scarce countries in the world, and to solve this problem, the King's government chose to create this new reservoir to become the country's biggest in the 1990s by damming up the local sidewaters or streams. A scientific survey, however, suggested that the ground was too salty to do this. It was, in fact, the dry bed of a once sister lake to the Dead Sea. However, the warnings were ignored, and due to alleged corruption, the project went ahead with great expense and the willing help of a UK engineering firm. And lo and behold, when the dam filled up, the water did indeed almost instantly become too salty to use. So what little water they had, what precious water they had in the Jordan Valley was wasted. This now stands as a monument to modern water mismanagement. Oh, I skipped ahead slightly there. Well, not that it matters, actually. I can show you both at the same time. But water mismanagement is far from just a developing country problem. Next, I went to the world's probably most famous water engineering system, the Colorado River leading up to Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam in Western USA. It's one of the great engineering achievements of the 20th century. It allowed a vast movement of people to the American West. It caused deserts to bloom. It supposedly decoupled man from a reliance on nature. The trouble is it didn't, and it's now running out of water. That white line you see running up to the Hoover Dam is now known as the bathtub ring, because it clearly shows where the lake height used to be and what it's drained down to now. That difference is 43 meters, in fact, so only 3 meters shy of the Statue of Liberty. And these tall towers here are the water intake towers for the hydroelectricity. We should only see the tips of those. Those are intake gratings, if that's the right word. So those are standing tall and naked when they should be underwater. Now, those islands you see behind me, in fact, the entire shoreline should all be underwater. You should only really be able to see those mountains in the distance. Here's my host, Justin Patterson of the National Park Service, looking down at the vertigo-inducing water loss. And whole harbours that used to be full of leisure boaters are now closed due to lack of water. Now, some of you might be aware that Colorado and California actually had record snowfall this year, and Lake Mead started going up for the first time in years, which it has. But I visited in 2021, and the lake level hasn't even bounced back yet to those record low figures. So here's the graph filling up. So yes, Lake Mead has gone past its 2022 low. There's the 2023, but it's not yet at 2021. Now, I did take this snapshot in July, but I checked it just before this talk, and it's still below. So if I skip back again, even though it's had a record snowfall year, it's still, the water is actually lower now than it is in the pictures that I took. So part of the issue, and by the way, the long-term trend, I'll go back to this graph, the long-term trend still points in the same direction, which is the lake reaches dead pool by the end of this decade, meaning it would drop below the hydroelectricity intakes, the lowest point of the intakes for the Hoover Dam, and effectively the Colorado River would no longer flow beyond the Hoover Dam to the 40 million people downstream that rely on its water. It turns out that building the country's largest reservoir in a desert loses a lot to evaporation. Lake Powell, the holding reservoir to Lake Mead, loses a cubic kilometre of water a year to evaporation and seepage. Now, picture a cubic kilometre in your head. It looks exactly how you would imagine. Like this, in fact. This is an illustration of what a cubic kilometre would look like in Manhattan, New York, looming over all the skyscrapers. Now, keep that picture in mind as I go on to talk about multiple cubic kilometres later in the talk. But to what extent, sorry, I'm getting a bit erratic with my laser pen. To what extent is this a human mismanagement issue? This is a view of Lake Mead from the sky. I was very happy to get a window seat for this particular flight. There's Lake Mead. There's still Lake Mead. It's a big one. But that water channel you see snaking out there isn't the Colorado River. It's actually a great irrigation canal called the Central Arizona Project, or the CAP Canal. This runs hundreds of kilometers through the Sonora Desert into Arizona and feeds the cities of Phoenix and Tucson, as well as numerous farms in between. I call it Arizona's umbilical cord in the book because it has allowed Arizona to grow big and plump in this artificial womb of Colorado River water. Its cities have grown large in it, but the cord is about to be cut as Lake Mead levels fall ever lower. And these cities spawned by Lake Mead will soon have to find their own water independence at the mercy of the desert. This is what it looks like from the ground, by the way, essentially a large and wide artificial river through the desert. When I say canal in a UK context, we have an image of quite a narrow water channel, but this is several times larger than an English canal. So what has Arizona been doing with all that water? Here's a couple of examples. I mean, the short answer is being wasteful, but here's a couple of examples. This is flood irrigation. This is common practice in Phoenix suburbs. It's the opposite of hosepipe bans. You just turn on a spigot valve at the bottom of your garden and flood your whole garden with water from the Colorado River, which has no natural right to be in the Sonoran Desert. As one lady I spoke to told me, surrounded by grapefruit trees and lemon trees and orange trees, she said, yeah, I realize the contradiction, but it makes for a mighty fine garden. And in the heart of Phoenix, Arizona's largest city, is the dead dry riverbed of the once mighty Salt River that the city's rapid growth already used up and dried up decades ago. But they quite liked having a waterfront for weekend walks. So in the 1990s, they built two dams a couple of kilometers apart and filled it up with water, creating Tempe Town Lake. And where is all that water from? You guessed it, the CAP Canal, from the ailing Lake Mead and the ailing Colorado River. So I can't stress enough, the water we have had and do have, we treat very poorly indeed. And that's just the surface water. Groundwater in the aquifers beneath our feet has also been pillaged over the same time period as pumps became more powerful and drilling ever deeper. This is the work of water superstar academic Jay Famiglietti and his team at NASA. This graph shows groundwater loss in California's Central Valley from the 1960s to 2020. The y-axis is in cubic kilometers, minus 20, minus 40, minus 60. So keep that picture of Manhattan in your head for each of those cubic kilometers. Between 2003 and 2010, Jay's team found that the loss rate averaged 4.4 cubic kilometers. That's equivalent to 2 Loch Lomans of water lost every year, and loss meaning not replenished by rainfall. What does losing that amount of groundwater do? Here's a famous picture Jay likes to show of Joe Poland of the US Geological Survey in 1977. Joe wanted to communicate how much land subsidence was being caused by this excessive groundwater pumping. And using survey data, he marked on a telegraph pole in the valley where the ground level would have been in 1955 and where it would have been in 1925. If you keep sucking an aquifer dry, the weight of earth above crushes it down and you lose that storage capacity forever. If you keep on doing this, eventually you will run out of aquifer and you will run out of groundwater. And apologies for the image quality of this one, I won't show it very long, but Jay updated the Joe Poland picture for the 2010s, and effectively you'd need to stack another telegraph pole on top of Joe's. But ground subsidence only looks neat and uniform in agricultural systems where the evidence is effectively ploughed over and covered up every year. Here's what it looks like now out in the scrub near Phoenix, Arizona. As the CAP canal begins to be cut, farmers who have been used to that abundance of water are returning to groundwater pumping. The subsidence causes these great ground fissures to form, looking like sandworm tunnels from the film Dune. This was meters deep and ran for over a kilometre. Now, this was out on the scrub, but I also saw some near housing developments and roads too, so they're starting to cause real infrastructure problems. And this is what farming tends to look like in much of the US. It's called center pivot irrigation. A circular field essentially is drawn and watered by a single remote controlled irrigation arm that radials out from the center. In the center, it'll be typically connected directly to a groundwater borehole. Then every hose provides an even spread of water to the crop. And the circular field is typically 1 kilometer in diameter. It's actually not a bad, form of agriculture. You could argue it's water efficient. All the drops are going to the crop. However, it's only water efficient if you've got enough water in the first place. This is what a bunch of them look like from the air. This is the American Midwest now. I describe it in the book as looking like picnic plates dropped on a sandy beach. Because again, in Arizona, this is desert. This level of agriculture has no right to be there. And perhaps you can make an argument that, well, we need to feed people. But the majority crop grown in Arizona is alfalfa, which is a forage crop used to feed cattle. And the majority of that is exported overseas. So we need to increasingly question the crops we grow, where and why. One of the major importers, this slide's been playing up, so let's cross fingers that it works well. One of the major importers of Arizona's alfalfa, and indeed one of the major owners of Arizona farms now, is Saudi Arabia. It used to grow its own wheat and alfalfa via its own center pivot irrigation boom in the 90s and 2000s. And this is a slow motion of what happened. I'll pause it there. 2012 was about the peak. So this is the Wadi As-Siran basin, and at the height of the boom, farmers were pumping an annual average of 18.5 cubic kilometers of groundwater. That sounds an almost unfathomable amount, but remember, each of those little dots is a 1 kilometer radius circle. So it does start to add up. But again, this is desert. There's no rain for irrigation. This is all coming from groundwater. And in this part of Saudi Arabia, it's all fossil water, essentially. It's not being replenished. So this was water from a previous geological era, in this case, about 20,000 years ago. And pumping that is directly synonymous to pumping oil. Once it's gone, it's gone. If we let this run back to 1987 again, because this is effectively what it will return to. By the 2010s, 4/5 of the water in the Wadi As-Siran basin had been used up. In 2016, Saudi banned domestic wheat production, and its booming dairy industry had to look elsewhere, including Arizona. The groundwater loss is part of England's story too. Remember the rainfall map showing most of the rainfall in the west of the country? Well, by quirk of geology, the east is home to all the country's chalkstone. And its chalk aquifers produce not only the most diverse river ecosystems we have, known as chalk streams, but also the purest drinking water too. The water companies only have to sink a borehole into the chalk aquifer and they draw out naturally chalk filtered water. And as the population has grown and rainfall become less reliable, ever more boreholes were sunk and abstraction rates increased. Now keep that image on the left of the pristine chalk stream in your head with its golden glittering gravel, the abundant water crowfoot flowing in the fast-moving water. Because as we'll see, not so many of them look like that anymore. This one's the River Lark. one of barely 200 chalk streams, not only in the country, but in the entire world. The chalk stream is almost unique to Eastern England, save for just a handful in northern France. Here's one of them now, just a canalised ditch running through a Tesco car park. But at least it had water in it. The next one I went to see was the River Ivel. In the 19th century, this powered a number of water mills on its banks. Now it's just a collection of stagnant puddles because the local water company takes all the water from the aquifer. And this is the River Quin, often no flow at all, save for a trickle of effluent from the local sewage works. And did someone say sewage? Well, as you might now be aware, water companies throughout England and Wales have been illegally releasing untreated sewage in almost all of our rivers and streams. I say you might now be aware because when I started writing the book, only a few lone voices such as the campaigner Fergal Sharkey were raising the alarm. The story only finally broke in 2020 thanks to journalism from The Guardian and the ENDS report. But believe you me, raw sewage was being released for many years before that. The sewage scandal is a whole talk in itself. I could do a talk on it. I dedicate many pages to it in the book. But for the purposes of today's talk, water quality and water quantity are two sides of the same coin. So a polluted river is almost as useless as an empty one. And sometimes it takes the eyes of an outsider to sum it up, as this headline from the American publication The Atlantic does. Why Britain stinks. Thanks to decades of underinvestment and mismanagement, sewage is flowing into rivers and seas. Well, that about sums it up. Now, one of the lone voice campaigners who brought the scandal to national attention was Ash Smith on the River Windrush in Oxfordshire. Here's Ash and his dog Archie about to take me for a walk. Again, this should be an idyllic Cotswolds river, but it's now home to sewage fungus and human detritus. Here's a couple of before and afters on Ash's website. The same spot taken 10 years apart. A once pristine river, now murky and grey with sewage. But to show you there's nothing unique about the Windrush, here's the situation on a national scale. The Rivers Trust maintain an online interactive map called Is My River Fit to Play In? Each brown duck, and I really strongly recommend that anyone that lives in England and Wales looks up, Google this website, look up your local river. Now, each brown dot denotes an untreated sewage spill event and records how many hours it spilled for. As you zoom in, it looks like this. This is a Yorkshire water area, but I could have picked any area really. It's all of our rivers almost all of the time. The one I click on, don't worry if you can't read it, it's saying that a sewer storm overflow spilled 71 times for 461 hours into the River Calder in 2022. But as I say, click on any river, you will find similar figures. So the answer to the question, is my river fit to play in, is no, which should be a source of national shame. Now I've thoroughly depressed you. It's even depressing myself at moments there. Let's look at solutions. Trigger warning, there might still be some depressing bits, but there is definite light coming very soon. Just not quite at this bit. This is the one that everyone asks about, that many people think will save us or presume will save us, desalination, i.e. turning seawater into drinking water. I finally got my chance to visit a desalination plant when I was in Accra, Ghana. This is it from the outside. This is a panoramic taken from the inside. It's a big, impressive site, and it delivers much needed drinking water to the eastern quarter of the city. But it also tells the story of why desalination isn't the answer for the world. Now, countries such as Israel have largely solved their water crisis through desalination. In Israel, the National Water Company operates over 30 desalination plants like this, in fact, far bigger than these. It treats close to 1 million cubic meters of water every day in Israel, providing some 85 to 90% of water supply. So far, so good. But Israel is a small, wealthy, high-tech country with a Mediterranean coastline spanning its entire length. Most countries don't tick all those boxes. Neighbouring Jordan only has a tiny sliver of coast far away from its major cities. Now, Jordan is currently building a large desalination plant to solve its water crisis, but the water is projected to cost $3 per cubic metre compared to Israel's 40 cents. Now, many believe it will be far too costly for either Jordan's bill payers or for the government to subsidise. And indeed, the one I visited in in Ghana in the picture, similarly hemorrhages money for the government. And in fact, it was forced to close down for 3 years because the government couldn't afford to keep it open. It only reopened again because of the COVID crisis. Now, the costs, by the way, are largely because of the huge amount of energy required to run the reverse osmosis process to force the salt out. In most desalination processes, for every litre of potable water produced, a further 1.5 litres of waste brine is created. And there's currently no environmentally sustainable way of disposing of it. It's all just currently chucked back out to sea. The Persian Gulf, surrounded by the mighty desalination plants of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, is now in places 25% saltier than average seawater. Now, the saltier it becomes, the harder and more costly it is to desalinate. And of course, from an environmental perspective, it's devastating. Sea life dies out. Now, there's talk of reaching peak salt in some regions, whereby the sea is too salty to feasibly desalinate. I actually saw evidence of that in the Karameh Dam, again, the salty reservoir I visited in Jordan. And when the realization hit that the reservoir was too salty, to save face, the government built an adjacent desalination plant. But within months, it was forced to close because the water was too salty. So eventually, we will start to see that happen in some coastal areas. So desalination will grow. It is the answer for some coastal regions and countries, but it's not a silver bullet. A desalinated world with dead oceans and unaffordable water is no utopia. A slightly more promising option, actually a much more promising option, is wastewater treatment, also known as toilet to tap. The technologies exist now to treat sewage water directly to drinking water quality standard. The process is essentially very similar to desalination. Again, it's large reverse osmosis plants, so the same energy costs and caveats apply, but the feedstock is sewage, not seawater. Singapore pioneered this in the 2000s. They call it new water. That's a picture of one of their plants in the slide. It now has 5 new water plants in operation, producing 30% of Singapore's total water needs. It's building a 6th plant and aiming for 50%. Now, other water scarce regions are looking to get in on the act, including California. They've gone for the branding pure water, and a large plant is being built in San Diego to open in 2025. But as its costs spiral into the billions, as this local San Diego editorial recognizes, the water that comes out of it will be expensive. And that's not something that US citizens are used to. They're used to cheap, if not free, water provided by the mega dams and canals built by the Bureau of Reclamation in the 20th century. Now, those days are over, or at least coming to an end, and that painful political realization is happening before our eyes. Another big centralized solution is managed aquifer recharge, or MAR. This is a borehole that gives water back to an aquifer rather than taking out from it. The extra water can be captured and treated stormwater, and as we've seen, we can expect many more extreme weather events to come. So let's capture some of that for the dry times. Strangely, MAR isn't widely done in the UK. Many countries don't do it at all, and some have gone for it in a big way, such as the Netherlands and Australia. And there's various methods of doing it, such as simply percolating through sand dunes. There's rainwater capture, infiltration ponds, soil aquifer treatment. So it's something we need to do far more of. Here's an intriguing off-grid tech solution, kind of the opposite of the big centralized solutions we've just seen. This is water from air technology. These aren't solar PV panels, but solar hydro panels. They create an artificial dew point inside to condense and capture moisture in the air. This particular company's Source, based in Arizona, believe these offer the decentralized future of water supply. But each panel only produces around 3 litres of water a day. So this is only really for drinking water. But they do already have some set up in schools, hospitals, including in the developing world. Now, many tech solutions are much more mundane. Agriculture may account for 70% of water use globally, but in the UK, the biggest water user at just over 50% is households. And we could all easily use less water. Now, this is my dishwasher. It's nothing fancy, it's not top of the range, it's a Bosch, but it only uses 6.5 litres on an eco cycle. By comparison, a typical kitchen tap runs at 12 litres a minute. So washing in an economical dishwasher compared to under a running tap saves a lot of water. As for the kitchen tap itself, you can fit an aerator to it. That just screws onto the end of a normal kitchen tap. That reduces the water coming out of it by half. And actually, you can increase the pressure with the spray setting. And you can fit a rainwater butt or two to your house or garden shed. Again, these are from my house. That's all I did, really. There's aerators on all the taps and showers. Well, I've only got one shower in my house. We're a normal family of 4 other than that. But those measures alone halved our water use. We now use around 80 litres per person in the house, compared to the national average of 150 litres, with very little expense or pain. And some water companies give away those aerators for free, by the way, or you can get them for a couple of quid off eBay. Now, if you want to go all in, there's much fancier options, such as plumbing rainwater tanks to flush your toilet. There's air flush toilets that barely use any water. There's water recycling showers. IKEA are working on one that only uses 20% of the water of a standard shower. But my main point is that though it would be great to see those things catch on, and I'm sure they will, you don't even need to go that far. A few simple measures can slash household water use and therefore water demand. And here's water efficiency taken to the nth degree. This is less of a tech solution and more of a social solution, but I wanted to squeeze it in. In Las Vegas, they take water efficiency extremely seriously. The historical reason is they were never given as much water from Lake Mead for Nevada. Nevada was given a much smaller allowance than Arizona. So Nevada has grown up water efficient. Now in Las Vegas, water efficiency officers patrol the streets in cop-like cars. This is Officer Cameron Donnarumma on patrol, and the patrol is 24/7. There's a night shift doing this. I joined him at 6 a.m. Now, you're only allowed to water your garden or wash your car on allocated days. If any water flows off your property or onto a sidewalk, you will be fined, punishable by law. Front gardens are banned. It's kind of amusing, and the tagline on the side of the car is "Water Patrol to protect and conserve," which is kind of tongue-in-cheek and part NYPD, part Paw Patrol. But it's deadly serious too. Hundreds of fines are handed out. Repeat offenders can be fined up to $1,300. Ultimately, as communities face up to genuine water scarcity, water efficiency begins to look like this. Now, you might be able to be wasteful with your money in Las Vegas, but you can't be wasteful with your water. And finally, onto nature-based solutions, and this is all cheery. There's no doom and gloom. Doom and gloom alarm over. Entering fun times. Starting with Y fronts. Now, why am I and Oxfordshire farmer James Alexander standing in a field sheepishly holding up pairs of cotton underpants? Because we're about to bury them. And before I explain that bit, let's take a step back and remember where our water comes from in the first place: rainfall. All our water supply and water quality comes down to how and where that rainfall is captured. And the majority of our rain falls on farmland, specifically farmland in winter. Remember, the UK is winter rainfall reliant. If the soil is ploughed and left bare in winter, anyone who's spent a bit of time in the countryside will tell you it causes a muddy runoff, losing topsoil and silting up streams and rivers. It misses that crucial step of infiltrating down into the groundwater aquifers. To do that, you need root structure. Root structures hold the soil in place and the water can head downwards as it would in natural grassland or forest. Now, back to the Y fronts. James is an unusual farmer in more ways than one, in that he's a contract farmer. He farms other people's fields for them. And on his patch are all three farming types: conventional farming with ploughing and artificial fertilizer, organic farming, and no-till farming, a relatively new farming movement, albeit based on ancient practices, in which you never plough the soil, always leaving root structure in place from crop after crop. It's been shown to be great for soil health, biodiversity, and crucially for us, water infiltration, more than double the hourly rainfall infiltration rate compared to conventional ploughed fields. Burying the pants is just a fun way of proving that. As part of the hashtag #SoilMyUndies challenge that started amongst Californian farmers, you bury cotton underpants in your field, dig them up 3 months later, and the more degraded they are, the better your soil health and the better your water infiltration. So we buried 3 pairs in all 3 field types. We came back and dug them up 3 months later. And here's the results scientifically displayed in the boot of James's 4x4. Now, the organic, pretty eaten up, but weirdly clean. The no-till, a pleasingly dirty, eaten up mess. And the conventional ploughed field, well, put that in a 40-degree wash and I'd probably rewear those. So, fun point proven. The no-till field's soil health was far better. That particular field hadn't been ploughed for over 20 years. James says it gives him his best crop, best yield, barely needs any fertilizer, and acts like a sponge in heavy rain. So when other nearby fields are causing the roads to turn into muddy rivers, he says you can walk his no-till field and not even get your boots wet. Now, water companies are waking up to this, and fast. Many are now directly paying farmers in key river catchments to keep a cover crop on their fields over winter. The next step will surely be full no-till. A water company director actually told me anecdotally that he had asked his team of engineers to calculate the difference it would make to their water supplies if all farming in their region became no-till. And they told him it would be the underground equivalent to building the country's biggest reservoir on their patch, without, of course, the many years and billions of pounds needed to build a new reservoir. So using our land more effectively and mimicking nature will capture the rain for us. As well as mimicking nature, we need to restore nature. So wildflower meadows, especially those on floodplains, are, in a sense, the ultimate no-till field. This illustration from the Open University shows why. The root depth of many wild floodplain meadow plants is up to and above 2 meters. So combined, they create a sponge, holding water for dry times and letting it seep down into aquifers during floods. These root structures are also great, by the way, for carbon sequestration, the equivalent to peat beds, according to one study. The problem is we've treated these meadows appallingly. Almost all were ploughed up for agriculture in the 20th century. Of the pristine, never been ploughed floodplain meadows, there's believed to only be 4 square miles of it left in England. I visited one just outside of Oxford. I've got a picture of it here. And it is extraordinary, and some extraordinary people, including the Nature Recovery Network, are trying to create a corridor of these restored floodplain meadows. We need them to succeed, and currently they're receiving very little help to do so. Our rivers need restoring too, and reconnecting with those floodplains. From the Victorian era onwards, the prevailing mindset was to straighten and deepen rivers, to funnel water away as quickly as possible and drain adjacent land to make it farmable. The problem from a water perspective is that it disconnected the river from the crucial floodplain stage where water infiltrates down into the aquifers. The aquifers weren't being fed, as it were. And in times of flood, this straightened, deepened channel sped up water and caused disaster downstream. Our response for decades has simply been to dredge more, make them deep, which simply adds more fuel to the floods. There's now a big movement to rewild or re-wiggle our rivers. So this is a before and after of Swindale Beck. This straightened channel, artificially straightened channel before, and this renaturalized, re-meandering channel. As you can see, the rewilded river is actually longer as it twists and turns. That's adding 180 meters in length per kilometer. So it's not hard to see how that would slow and hold and absorb more water. And this is happening internationally too. Just one floodplain restoration scheme in the Central Valley, California, has been calculated to conserve 1 billion gallons of water a year. That's equivalent to a modest desalination plant. Chennai in India lost its surrounding wetlands due to modern development. The city literally ran out of water in 2019. It had its day zero crisis. It's now in the process of restoring its wetlands, ponds, and floodplains, recognizing that natural infrastructure is essential to its water future. Here's another UK example. This is a 3-year project on the National Trust's Holnicut estate in Somerset to reconnect a section of the River Aller to its floodplain. They've described it as a control-alt-delete, a computer reset of the river. And this is what the River Aller looks like now. So we need to do much more of this. The UK lost over 90% of its wetland habitat to modern agriculture. And now you might notice a lot of artificially felled trees spread out. This is known as leaky dams. That helps the river to spread out and widen. It cost the National Trust £650,000 to do all that work. And I would still argue that's money very well spent. But do you know what would do that job for us at no expense and totally naturally? Yes, beavers. Now, I didn't know until researching this book that the beaver was endemic to the UK until relatively recently. The last record of a beaver was near York in 1789. So right up until the 18th century, rivers such as the one in the previous slide were wide and strewn with trees and dams. Our natural water system, our aquifers, require beavers. Beavers are as British as fish and chips, which, by the way, only became the national dish after we ran out of beaver tail for beaver tail and chips. And that is a genuinely true story. And beaver reintroductions began tentatively in Scotland in the 2000s, but they're now happening all over the place, all over England. I went to visit one in Derbyshire. This is great news for water companies. Some have even contributed the funding to make them happen. The Derbyshire one was partly funded by Severn Trent, and they describe beavers now as wetland engineers and keystone species, meaning their activity can bring a wide benefit of ecological and economic benefits. During dry summers, beaver dams and canals have been shown to hold more than 60% more water than comparable environments without beaver activity. And that water seeps underground, alleviating droughts. This illustration on the right just kind of explains how and why. The beavers build a dam, causing the channel to widen. The river expands and contracts with rainfall. And while you might start off with a little tree loss to start with, by the end you end up with a much greener, wetter environment with more trees and more biodiversity. So bringing back beavers is a win-win. There is no downside. And before you can save farmers' fields, DEFRA already has an environmental land management payment system to compensate farmers. So simply add flooding loss due to beaver reintroduction to the compensation package. But beavers won't be flooding pristine, untouched farmland anyway. This will be the corners of fields that already flooded. And ultimately, this is the main point, ultimately restored, replenished aquifers is a good thing for farmers too. And this simple illustration makes much the same point. In fact, I probably could have spared you much of the previous 50 minutes and just shown you this. This is by Brazilian environmental group Água Sua Linda, and it really neatly sums up how the natural system works. Rivers swell onto their floodplains, then narrow again and change course. And then this is what we did to them. We canalized them, straightened them, built on their floodplains. And now when it floods, the water has nowhere to go. It's sitting on tarmac, on concrete, and eventually running down the drain, not into the aquifers. Now, it's too late to turn back the clock entirely, but we can look to build parks and wetlands back into our towns and cities too. This is known rather unexcitingly as sustainable urban drainage, or China came up with a far catchier title, sponge cities. And there's a smorgasbord of options available. The infiltration basins, ponds, trenches, green roofs, pervious pavements, wetlands within your parks. So remember, it's all about capturing rain when it falls and then using it locally or letting it fill up the aquifers below. Now, whether anything I've talked about today actually happens and in what order, of course, all comes down to politics. The current Rishi Sunak UK government has recently started rolling back environmental legislation. In other countries, governments have been overthrown for doing so and new constitutions drawn up just in the time I've been writing this book. Our water quantity and water quality rests entirely on the strength of our environmental laws and how well they are enforced, as we've seen with the sewage scandal. But I want to leave you on a very positive note, as well as ticking the right box when you get to vote, which will hopefully be soon. There's a lot that we can do as individuals. All the people pictured in this slide are water heroes I met along the way. Some started as just one-person bands, very lone voices, attempting to speak up for their local rivers and water sources. All of them began to raise attention, grow local press interest, then national, in some cases international. So never underestimate the power of your voice. I've seen it make a big difference. We wouldn't have known about the sewage scandal if it weren't for campaigners like Ash Smith on the Windrush, noticing what was happening, compiling the data and making a noise that eventually could not be ignored. So I hope this talk leaves you feeling hopeful, not hopeless. There's a lot of problems to be solved, but if we all take action, we can solve the water crisis together. Thank you very much for listening.